Welcome and thank you everyone for joining us on today's AI Explained on building agents at scale, lessons from the front lines featuring AWS Strands. My name is Will Pong. I'm VP of Product Management here at Fiddler AI, and I'll be your host today. Just a little bit of housekeeping here. You can put questions in the Q&A box at any time during this fireside. So today's session will also be recorded and sent to all attendees after as well. So feel free to engage with us. Now, we have a very special guest on today's AI Explained, and that is Gary Stafford, Principal Solutions Architect at AWS Strands. He's a seasoned technology leader, speaker, and author, where he's applied his deep expertise in AI ML, data analytics, enterprise architecture, and software development in order to support a wide range of enterprises and partners across industries. Welcome, Gary. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you. You just set a high bar.
Oh, I'm very excited to dig in with you here. But first and foremost, maybe you could take a minute and share a little bit of your background and history with us. What should we know about you as we enter into this conversation about agents and AI?
Sure. So I've been at AWS for about 6 years now, 6 years in September. I started in the Bay Area with our venture capital team with startups, but have worked across enterprise, greenfield, what we refer to as digital native businesses. So I've spent most of my time here with customers that are all in on the cloud. And then most recently in the ad tech space and the media and entertainment space.
That's awesome. So, a lot of range of different companies there, but I think one thing that we share in common is thinking about that sort of enterprise layer in particular and how we sort of bring AI transformation and adoption to that layer. So I'm curious, just asking you this question, as lots of enterprises are exploring the idea of AI, how should enterprises decide whether or not a particular problem or challenge in front of them calls for an agentic or an AI type approach? What kind of rubric or sort of process do you put these teams through to figure out what's right for them?
Sure. I think it's interesting and somewhat unique with generative AI and agents and agentic workflows. Oftentimes that is the reason, right? Their stockholders, their senior executives have told them that they need to develop a product or a service that has GenAI, even if it's just for marketing purposes. And I think that aside, which is a legitimate request from a customer, I think what we try to do is go in and understand the problem first. And I think of all the Amazon concepts that we have, I think working backwards is probably my favorite one. So if we're allowed, sometimes the customer's like, I have to use AI, let's just start there. But if we have the opportunity to really work backwards and understand the problem, because to that point, I think it was the same with generative AI. Oftentimes these are solved problems, whether it's statistical analysis, data analytics, traditional machine learning. There's already solutions out there which are probably quicker and maybe cheaper for the customer. So I think we really seek to understand that problem before we suggest a solution.
So what I'm hearing from you is the impetus can come from one of two places. One is sort of a top-down initiative, almost like a skunk works or a lab. Hey, we need to get in AI, get in there fast. We don't know what to do, but we have a great partner in AWS. Let's go lead on Gary. That's sort of pattern one.
Absolutely.
Pattern number two is sort of, hey, we have these processes. They could be customer facing. They could be back office facing. We know we want to bring AI to these processes in order to transform our business. So it's sort of like these two things that are there. I'm curious on the sort of top-down side or the mandate side, to your point, what do you see teams end up doing in that case? Do they stand up centralized teams? Do they sort of have one team be a guinea pig and try something? What are some patterns you've seen on that side?
Yeah, I think initially, and probably this might be just because at AWS, we tend to be, IT oriented and we're talking to technical folks. Oftentimes those conversations going back to even generative AI, like 2023, started with the technical folks. But I think as AI has expanded, the importance of AI, of agentic systems have expanded. More often now we're talking to certainly somebody with a level of technical understanding, but oftentimes there's a product development person in there, a product manager, and a business person. And oftentimes that's because we're trying to solve a larger problem or trying to add a feature to a product versus just trying to implement a new technology like a new database engine. You're really talking about a new feature, a new product, or a new technology the company hasn't explored before.
Yeah, that's a great point. This isn't just a capability. It's actually now some kind of outcome you're trying to drive, right?
That's
So it
right.
sounds like you have to be more holistic than just saying, okay, I've got this latest way that'll drive down your latency by this much, just go implement it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So switching to that side then, some of the sort of use cases that we talked about, What have you seen as maybe some trends or sort of repeatable things across the folks that you've worked with in terms of use cases that they'll want to explore using agentic technology?
Sure. So maybe just start, internal facing outward. In
Hmm.
AWS has always had, a strong area of expertise within multiple industries, but in the last few years we've really segmented and really focused on each one of those industrial segments. And I think
Hmm.
we'd love to lead with that and look for solutions that are specific to industries. But the reality is, and I don't want to say the majority of the time, but let's say half the time, the customer is looking to solve a problem that probably transcends that industry. Right to your point, you said back end. It's maybe a
Hmm.
mundane back end uh, system or workflow that they have that if they can optimize that, they reduce labor, they can reallocate that labor to maybe focus on their core business more. So I would say it's a combination of both front customer facing products and features, but also just more back end task automation.
Okay. So let's take a half a step back then as we start thinking about solutions there. Um, we've both used the term Gen AI and agentic a little bit. But I'd love to know from your point of view, what's the difference, especially for folks that are a little bit newer to these technologies? What does it mean to use Gen AI generally? And then what are agents and how should we think about those capabilities being different?
Sure. I'll refer, I love Anthropic. I think Anthropic's done a great job in really
Hmm.
defining agents, obviously defining MCP, and I love to reference their website and they have some great
Hmm.
definitions. But when I think of an agent, I think of three things, right? An LLM, the ability to communicate with an LLM, the ability to use tools, and the ability to reason in an
Hmm.
agentic loop, right? So the ability to leverage Gen AI to leverage a large language model, which is capable of a generative process, whether that's text or image, and the ability to reason about tools and use those tools to derive an answer to a question or a query.
I see. So just reflecting that back to you, I think Gen AI approaches, even as we think about the last couple of years here, are a little bit more about that single turn of processing information, right? I'm a user asking a question of a chatbot, or maybe even if I'm a backend process, I take in some input and I give an output. But you're saying one big difference from agents, especially as Anthropic has helped us define, is the idea that that reasoning isn't just applied to the input from the user, but that reasoning is also applied to how to do the job. So reasoning about what plans to go make or what tools to go use and et cetera, that is what separates an agentic use case from sort of a more straightforward LLM based use case.
Yeah, I would say so.
Does
I
that
mean,
sound right?
it does. Yeah, I think they can be
Mhm.
non-deterministic, right? The way in which it decides to use those tools is purely non-deterministic, or it determines the use based on the input, and
Mhm.
what usually varies in that case. Or it can be deterministic, and there's frameworks that have more deterministic DAG-based workflows. But I think either way, where the agent is making the decision on which tools to use, I see that more as an agentic system where there's less determinism.
That makes sense. So let's tie that back to some of the business use cases that you've seen in the verticals that you've looked at, whether it's M&E or elsewhere. What are some particular use cases where this agentic approach, where the sort of the software itself is making plans and sort of figuring out what to do? Where is that particularly useful compared to the recent world where might have to code all of that logic ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think the obvious one, and this transcends AWS, and I think it goes for all vendors in this space, is really code development, code agents, co-pilots, coding assistants, and being able to develop what started off as a simple method or a class, and now developing an entire application, developing the testing, developing the documentation. With our product Hero, more of a spec-driven development where you're writing the requirements and it's creating the process and the flow using agents to develop that. I think that's the obvious use case. That's probably and probably one of the larger use cases that I think the entire industry is seeing. I think beyond that, there's the back office tasks. There's the back office automation. I have, one, two, or three humans in the loop with specialized knowledge, and this might not be their. Oftentimes, it's not their primary job, but they're required to perform some task, and that's usually an obvious area of automation to free them up to do their higher value tasks. And then I think the third one is more product and product feature, customer facing, being able to add AI or agentic capabilities to existing products or develop new products that have those capabilities. and working with customers to do that.
That makes sense. And let's dig into the sort of back office conversation a little bit more. Traditionally, you might argue that that world you just described is still broadly true, whether or not there's agents, right? I always think about back office automation, taking more stuff and putting it in code rather than having humans do rote work. So, how is this different than just using Zapier or using some integrations that sort of automate work generally, right? Why do agents make the difference here compared to the tools we've had before?
Yeah, and maybe I'll answer that with kind of the approach. And again, everyone has a little bit of different approach when they approach a problem or talking to a customer. And I come from a consulting background, so I think taking more of a consultative approach is understanding, who are the humans in the loop? What are their tasks? Are they specialized? But I think specifically to answer your question, is there institutional knowledge there that needs to be captured? So they're performing this task because they have particular knowledge that maybe no one else in the company does. And those are the type of tasks that I think agents can help with, right? So it's non-deterministic. The inputs can vary. Although the problem may have boundaries around it, the specific task can vary somewhat depending on the day, the week, the month, the particular scope of the problem. And then those humans in the loop are applying a particular knowledge that they have specific knowledge to the problem. And those are usually the types of problems where I think an agentic system can help or assist.
I see. That's really interesting. Do you have an example that maybe you can walk us through? You can feel free to sort of scrub it or sanitize it a little bit for our
Yeah,
conversation.
sure.
But, help us understand, what kind of use case where you've seen that institutional knowledge be able to be transferred to an agent and therefore automating work that needed a human before.
Yeah, I'll use one, and it's come up multiple times, so it's not specific to any customer. I'll use the sales process. So whether that's reaching out to a new prospect or responding to an inbound inquiry, or more often, let's say a contract is up for renewal or a customer's term for their contract is coming up, and oftentimes that's very much dependent on the sales team, how they address that, right? They get a Salesforce report or whatever system they're using. And then it's really up to them. Who do they engage? How do they engage? What channels do they use to engage? And oftentimes, if there's a high turnover in a sales team or folks are moving around in accounts, which happens everywhere, there's not a lot of knowledge of that customer. So we see that as an area. We see a lot of use cases where customers saying, I want to leverage the knowledge bases that I have. I have different systems that I use to drive sales. I have customer 360 data. How can I use that more intelligently? And most often I'll stop talking is, instead of reaching out to 20, 30, 40% of those customers, how can I touch 100% of my customers using automation and agentic workflows? But do that intelligently, leveraging knowledge that we have on those customers or institutional knowledge across the sales team.
Yeah, that really resonates with me because you can think of it in extremes, right? The 100% human piece. You might have a rockin' sales team that has a really great playbook. They have a great regional sales manager or something like that, but they're going to apply that playbook all the way across, right? MedPick or, hey, at our company, we do it like this and this, and we reach out after these many days. And you may actually, lose some of the context, especially if I'm a new rep ramping up. I might do some of the same tasks that the last person before me just did. And now the customer isn't happy. They're instead, you're feeling irritated, right? So there's a side where human is not enough. You need that nuance and history of how that account has gone. And then to your point on the other side, if we tried to do this with all code before agents came, the amount of branching logic that we'd have to write and how engineers have to be experts at the sales process, it becomes really brittle. And that's why people don't end up doing it. There's a long tail of automation of if this, then that at 3 or 4 or 5 different levels that are just really painful to do with traditional software. Now you picture flipping this, give an agent instructions like you would a new rep, and give it access to your CRM and all this information. Now you can say, look, this is the last time we did a touch point with them. We haven't done an EBR in a while, and my playbook says to do that every quarter. And by the way, if that's already happened and somebody's reached out in the meantime, so on and so forth, you give it those instructions, and now the agent's doing that job of creating its own branching logic. And an engineer doesn't have to write that out ahead of time and maintain it if anything changes. So yeah, that really resonates with me. In terms of back office work.
Yep. And that really transcends every industry. Every industry has that need, no matter what industry they're in.
That's right. It could be any enterprise process, right? This could now be HR. how we hire people or
Yes.
go through a performance process.
That's
This can
my
be
background, HR
marketing.
developer. Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
That's awesome. And you know the complexity there too, right? Upskilling people, looking across the board, hiring and moving on and all that kind of thing. So that really works for me as that sort of second example. So
Mhm.
let's flip the script a little bit. The third example you gave us is now we want to leverage AI to better serve our customers, not just to make our company more efficient, but actually to improve our offerings.
That's
So
right.
what have you seen on that side? You know, as you're on the front lines here, have there been any kind of particular patterns of where customers decide to use agents that make sense?
Mhm. Um, I'll answer that question maybe within the realm of agents. I'll start with MCP servers.
Sure.
So I work with a lot of customers, a lot of teams that have very mature APIs. So they're
Mm,
B2B or B2B2C, maybe not B2C, but they're working with businesses or indirectly those businesses are then having consumers consume their services. And oftentimes something as simple as standing up an MCP server. So being able to communicate with that API using natural language and then having their business partners stand up an agent which can communicate with their MCP server. And that often can be a fairly light lift for a company that has a mature engineering team that has a mature API. That's not a huge stretch for them to be able to add that capability. So we see that as
yeah.
kind of an easy path. Those are obviously for customers that have that ability.
So basically modernizing the way that software can talk to software, right?
That's right.
If you've got agents on either side, just throwing out some vanilla APIs may be actually very difficult. Setting up something like this fosters that collaboration.
Yeah.
That makes
Or just
sense.
just just another channel to consume their resources, their intellectual property, their products, in addition to an API. And you saw that and I know of several of the cloud vendors have released agent marketplaces or MCP server
Mhm.
marketplaces to make that easier to consume those services in the cloud.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Now, while we're on the topic of standards and protocols, you mentioned MCP. For those that are less initiated to this world, what is an MCP? How is that different than sort of the API approach that you talked about?
Yeah.
And why do teams need to learn a new skill like MCP in order to sort of make this work in the new world of agents?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer your question, but I love referring folks back to Anthropic because I think they've done a great
Mhm.
job as kind of the originator of that protocol and a lot of the thinking around that. Their documentation is excellent. Refer folks to that. But I think the model to context protocol, along with some of the other standards that are evolving, are important to customers, especially enterprise customers. You mentioned enterprise customers. I think the challenge is AI isn't new. Gen AI is relatively agents are very new. And in the absence of a lot of testing and evaluation and long-term production type architectures, I think at minimum, I'm seeing customers that want to adopt standards. So they want to make sure they're adopting a framework, let's say an agentic framework, that they're adopting one which follows standards, which gives them some guarantee of robustness, of performance, of security, that they're not using a proprietary system that will quickly evolve. And there's no guarantee, obviously, but I think that's the first question that we hear from a lot of customers is, what are the protocols, what are the standards that this particular framework uses that I can rely on that's an industry standard.
Yeah, that makes sense. You know, one thing that we hear a lot from our customers and folks that we talk to is also this idea that, you know, as much as we talked about so far, serving developers and building new ways to go do things,
Hmm.
we use that sales use case where we're actually seeing third party as well really get involved. The Salesforces of the world are also building agentic platforms on their own systems, right? And so on. So what you start seeing is a proliferation of first and third party agents hanging out in an enterprise that really need to start working together, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
Gary, tell us a little bit about this sort of multi-agent world and how
Hmm.
agents have to talk to agents. I think
Sure.
MCP is a part of that, to your point, but
Right.
what have you seen when it comes to orchestrating, you know, a bunch of these different players, right? If we think about the analogy of humans, this is when sales needs a handoff to marketing or product needs a handoff to customer success. This is what humans might do. How do we help these multi-agent systems perform really well also?
Yeah, that's right. And I think we think about that. So when we engage with a customer, it's really working backwards from that existing human structure, right? That typical
Mhm.
management hierarchy structure, specialization structure. So I may be very capable of performing multiple tasks, but there's other specialized tasks where I need to rely on my peers. And oftentimes that's a good entry point from moving from a single agent, an agent that has multiple tools available. I'm a carpenter. I have a dozen or 2 dozen tools that I can use and I'm competent in, versus I'm not a plumber or an electrician. I need to reach out to my peers in order to perform those specialized tasks. So when we engage a customer, we try to understand, what are the processes, who are conducting those processes, and are they specialized? So is there a logical separation of concern from I'll call it a human in the loop hierarchy that we can translate into agents? Does it make sense? Because oftentimes they're very compatible, right? If there's a natural segregation of duties there because of specialization, then that's probably a good sign that you want to move from a single agent to a multi-agent architecture, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, right? Let's say I'm a marketer and I want to run a campaign against, my most loyal customers.
Yep.
And what does that mean? It's an orchestration of how much they use the product and maybe how long they've been with my company, what their spend might be, and so on. So for me as a marketing human, I want to reach out to all these other humans or departments in my organization to figure it out. So let's say now I am an organization that wants to get into agents and I want to say, look, I want to bring that into technology. I heard Will and Gary talking, I want to automate all that. So what should I consider as an organization to sort of take that process and transform it, right? Do I have to learn anything, or do my teams need to know anything about that sort of agent to agent communication?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obvious ways that we have customers that do it all themselves. They're very competent and technical. There's certainly other customers that are extremely successful and maybe to some degree focus more on their core business and outsource that, right, with a lot of great partners out there and folks that can build that for them to build those systems. But I think it's really comes down to understanding what the problem is. What are all the tools that you're using as a human today? What are all those different capabilities? What are all the systems? We often look at what are all the data sources that you touch? What are all the systems that you touch, those APIs? Try and document all those. And, through that documentation, you're really kind of drawing out the architecture for that agentic system, single or multi-agent agentic system, and really diagramming out the existing process and then overlaying that with where can we implement automation that makes sense and that there's an ROI on for the customer.
So I think that's a great strategy. I'm curious, as we kind of get into implementing that then and sort of like building those systems that matter,
Yep.
are there tools that we should be considering or thinking about that facilitate that sort of agent to agent conversation? Let's say I did build a marketing agent that knew everything about my campaigns and I wanted it to be able to talk to a sales agent that had all that context about the relationship.
Yep.
How would I go about and do something like that?
Yeah, I think, I was going to say 6 months, but that's probably too far back with agents. But even 3 months ago, the answer probably was you would need to build something, right? You would need to, maybe you already have existing code or methods or functions to connect to those secondary systems. And it could be as simple as annotating those tools. But I would say today, and I think you touched upon this before, kind of with the explosion of, let's say, MCP servers, a lot of the systems that are very common in enterprises have MCP servers, or they're being developed very quickly. You mentioned Salesforce and some other systems. So it's probably easier today to plug into an existing MCP server and do that in a secure way with that agent and give that agent those capabilities without having to write code or having to go back and even something as simple as annotating existing code for the agent. So I think that's quickly evolving, but it's becoming easier and easier to connect to those third-party systems as we see vendors developing interfaces into their systems, agentic interfaces into their system.
That's really great. That is really the culmination of what we said earlier, right? MCPs are kind of a new way to expose this information functionality of the product. It's much more than saying these are API 2.0. This is actually almost like creating a GUI for your agent, right? This is how an agent understands how another agent's built, how it can talk to it, how it can work with it, and so on. So that's really great guidance for anyone who's looking into this and saying, look, I've got this whole ecosystem of different actors here. I want to make sure they talk to each other to do a particular task. The other sort of standard or protocol that we tend to see a lot is this idea of being able to see all of that activity. So now that we have those agents, let's say we got them talking to each other, how do we know that the handoff is successful? What were they saying to each other? And did they call each other unnecessarily, or did they do it well? So we hear a lot about open telemetry, or OTel for short, the
Sure.
ability to sort of see and sort of monitor what these folks are doing. Tell us a little bit about that standard. Have you seen this sort of help enterprises as they're trying to stand up these solutions? Are there other ways to think about observability? How do you see it?
Yeah, I was kind of laughing because I have a customer. I have actually a lot of customers that are into open standards and use
Mhm.
both first party AWS, but many use third party observability platforms. And OTel is
Mhm.
very important. Having open standards is very important to them. And it's nice to see Strands Agents, which is AWS's open source framework, but many of the other frameworks have adopted the open standards, which I think is great. And it shows the importance of those open standards for that. I think what's interesting, and I find myself and maybe other folks on the webinar today too, is real time logging is more important. To your point, I built an
Mhm.
agentic system, single agent, multi agent. I have multiple tools, and I get to an answer. But how did I get to that answer? Did it?
Mhm.
I would expect it to maybe make 2 or 3 calls, but it made 15. Or I had a funny use case. I was developing a system, and I got an answer back, and it was only later that I realized actually that was the LLM answering directly. The
Mhm.
agent had not actually used any of the tools to go out to the web and find the answer to the knowledge base. It tried to answer the question without the tools. And had I not used the observability tools that were available and looked through the logs, I probably wouldn't have realized that. So I think that real-time logging, especially during the testing and the development phase, is critical, not only to make sure it's working, but how is it working? Is it even though it's non-deterministic to some degree, it's still deterministic in that you would expect it to call certain tools, maybe in a certain order, or if it's calling too many tools, right? If it's going a minute or 2 minutes, you need to get that time down. How can you do that? So I think observability is critically important in agentic systems.
I think you got it. Yeah, out of the box, a lot of these agents are people pleasers by nature, so to speak,
Yes.
right? And they kind of their job oftentimes is to tell you what you want to hear. So that's where these tools that you talked about, being able to see what happened, was this an anomaly or not? And then, going further and actually tuning what you want to have happen. Maybe
Yes.
that's more explicit instructions in your prompt. Maybe that's actually behaving other parameters that will help it sort of stay more on rails or get more creative. There are a lot of things that we can play with to sort of manage agents almost like we manage our employees, right? Give them coaching and say, look, this worked out well. This was a bad example, man. Like, let's do it a different way next time. And the nice thing is, of course, with agents is you can encode that and make sure that they do it that way going forward. Right?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's an
Yeah.
evolving field, not to go off tangent, but how you encode that, right? That system prompt, that agent prompt, and the set of rules that you give it. And I think similar to any other system, right? Rules, what
Mhm.
happens when there's a failure, rules, and there's a degree of complexity, and I think that's still evolving in terms of what direction you give the agent and what context you give the agent in advance of using the tools.
So that's a perfect segue because, you're kind of mentioning in this example, you're not just a strategist and consultant, you're also a builder, right? And you've gotten hands-on with this stuff. I think a couple examples that I'm aware of is perplexity like search, a weather kind of function. Tell us a little bit, you can choose either of those examples or maybe walk us through one of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
What have you learned from a builder point of view about, this sort of agent piece? And
Sure.
more importantly, you know, how you kind of do this orchestration to your point. How do you know what good looks like compared to in the past when you wrote code and expected it to be performed the same way every time?
Yeah. Can I pick a third example? Not to go
Yes,
off the
please.
field. We just did a talk at LA Summit last week, and
Mm,
it's a recommendation of personalization engine using an
mm,
agentic approach. And that's probably just top of mind for me because I spent quite a bit of time on that. So we get a
mhm,
lot of requests for not how can I replace my existing personalization or recommendation system, more traditional machine learning approaches, which work very well, but can I augment that with generative
mm.
AI, which today I would say really more of an agentic approach, which incorporates generative AI into that. So spent a lot of time building out a system. And I think to your question, what did I learn? The first one, and it was what was part of the talk, is a majority of that system is not AI. A majority of that
Mm.
system is kind of those mundane. How does the customer log in? How do I authenticate the customer? How do I load balance the requests? How do I store the customer data? So the first 80% of that system is not agentic. It's really more of a feature of the system. that I can plug into the system to give it agentic capabilities. And I think that gets lost, right? As there's such hype around agentic AI and generative AI. You would think that that is the application, but the reality is that's more of a feature of the application, a smaller part of the entire application that you need to think about when you're developing, especially a new product. But yeah, no, I think going through that process, I think I talked about the one example, right? Getting answers back and not
Mhm.
the observability that I was collecting and the metrics that I was collecting, the telemetry, and then realizing, it's not actually calling the tools I think it's calling, or in some cases, it's using the LLM to try and answer it with its limited knowledge, with the context of the knowledge that the model had through its
Yeah.
training versus actually using the tools. And how do I instruct it to use the tools? And I think the one last thing, the one pattern which was interesting, and I haven't seen a lot around that yet, is I have two tools, and you're seeing this a lot often. There's always limits, right? There's token limits, there's number of call limits on a lot of these third-party tools. So I enabled it with two tools. Now, how do I load balance those two tools? I have two external sources of information. They're relatively the same, or maybe I'm using them within certain contexts. How do I direct the agent to use those tools in a particular way without dictating the order? So I think there's a lot of work around that, especially when you have a multi-agent agentic system, multiple tools, multiple MCPs, and there's definitely some coordination needs to happen through prompting and rules beyond just defining the tools. It's how do you use the tools effectively?
One thing I find so interesting about that is it kind of changes the role of testing. Where if you think about traditional software development, testing is about making sure the happy paths work the way they're supposed to. Like we already kind of know what should happen. And to an extent, software is software. We think that's of agents too. There's some tasks that they have to complete. But the pathway to that is also deterministic, to your point, in traditional software. So when we write things like unit tests, we say, look, I wrote the code to do X, Y, and Z. Make sure that the outcome happens the same way, and then look for anomalies in my system, right? Resources that weren't there, et cetera. Agents are a little different because you're not trying to pre-describe a path, to your earlier point. How do I tell it the tools that it needs, but not be so explicit about when they use them to where they're dependent on me and my instructions in order to win? So I'm curious, when you think about tuning up that system as you're getting ready for prime time or production, what are some tools that you've used to be able to, understand how your app is working at any given moment? We talked about observability, but I'm curious if there's anything that you've used to actually improve that process, basically tune up your agent before you release it out to the wild with customers or employees.
Yep. So I'll tell you what, I guess where my thoughts are and what I'm trying to develop. So I think in addition to traditional testing, right? Performance testing, unit testing, integration testing. And again, that application AI is just a feature. So all of that conventional testing is still important, right? You have methods which are annotated as tools, but they're still methods which are testable. I think another area of research, which probably needs more thought, is around, to your point, testing. And
Mm.
even though maybe the route that the agent takes or agents take is non-deterministic in terms of the tools that it uses, there's still probably a logical, if not ordering, a logical process that it's taking, right? I know it has to call current time and date. I know it has to create a sandbox and execute a script. I know it has to reach out through this web tool or to this third-party API. And I think within the context of that, you can write, I'll call them non-deterministic tests, right? You may not define the exact order, but some of the steps. And
Mm.
I think that type of testing, and I'm sure there's research into that, I find myself trying to write those type of tests.
And what's interesting is,
Kind of regex tests, right? In
yeah,
conventional sense, you're just kind of regexing to make sure it's calling the right tools. It may have called it 3 times. I don't care as long as it called it once. Because if it didn't call it, that could point to an error. If it called a tool I didn't expect, why is it calling that tool? Maybe that's a sign that I need to go back and retool my prompt or re-prompt engineer my system prompts.
you've got me excited on this topic because I think a lot of what you're describing, it almost blurs the lines of how we coach people versus how we write software, right? A lot of times we tell high performers, look, I don't care how you get there. I just need you to go do these things, right? This is really important in this project to make sure we cover 1, 2, 3, 4 things. Look into it. Let me know what you need to do. Let me know if there's some blockers, but otherwise have a good day. And then, when we're done with this, give me a report, right? We often give instructions to agents in a similar way. Look, you've got to accomplish these things and you have these tools at your disposal. How you use them, feel free. We trust you. Go ahead and try it. And that, I think, is the thing you've got to see. In other words, not just giving those instructions, but starting to understand how your agent interprets those instructions and whether or not you need to put more guidance around them as a second, third, fourth round and kind of go.
That's right. That's right.
So here's what I'm thinking about as you're sharing that then. Let's say we're getting to that point. Okay, we've augmented our instructions. Now we know, okay, in this case, Billy the agent, you have to go do this instead of that. And we feel like we've got a pretty good instruction set here and pretty good tool calls and things like this. Now we have to think about putting this in production. So tell us a little bit about that. As you're thinking about putting these solutions, whether it's a personalization engine you talked about or other things, what are some pitfalls that we might encounter when we're trying to scale this up to many, many users?
Yeah. So a couple thoughts. One thought is, and we're all guilty of this, with the excitement around AI, generative AI and agents and all these evolving technologies, is oftentimes we're only focused on the POC or the MVP. And in some cases, that is the deliverable, right? Whether we want to admit that as vendors, sometimes the objective was to create a POC to prove that we could implement AI sometime in the future. But for folks that want to develop a solution and go into production, I think oftentimes with AI, we're not putting enough thought into will it scale, right? Am I picking the right model? I'm not saying build out a production architecture for a POC, but also I see sometimes a lack of thought in terms of how will this scale? And now you have a successful POC, but now you have just as much hardware to try and productionalize it because there wasn't a lot of thought put into that during the POC, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. One of the core examples that are coming to mind for me is identity and access. We talked about back office just now.
Yeah.
And as a developer, oftentimes, what do? We say, okay, in order for my agent to work, I'm going to give it God mode powers, right? Here's this admin token that can access anything and everything because I'm just trying to build this, right? I don't want to worry about all that. But then we release it to production and we realize all of the calls, like all of the Slack messages that are being sent or all of the emails that are being, forwarded or whatever it is, or documents created and so on, they're all created by Billy the agent. It's not actually by the users that are doing it. So now I have no insight on who does what. Now I've given people powers that they probably shouldn't have in the organization. I'm really stuck. So being able to build agents that can inherit the access of the user requesting things or can intelligently hand off to different folks in the organization, that's really difficult. And that's an example of production issues that may occur. I'm curious if you encountered that or any other kind of similar sort of production things that you don't think about when you're building, but you think about when you deploy and scale.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe two thoughts. One is, and certainly not to disagree with, I agree with you, it's complex, but I also think, and I see a lot of that, let me put it another way. A lot of that thought has already gone into distributed systems, into microservice-based architectures, right? I have multiple microservices. Each one of those have a specific role, just like an agent. They have different permissions, right? So oftentimes we're sometimes guilty of ignoring existing architectures because we think AI is totally new, but there's a lot of people that argue a lot of those patterns are just repeating themselves. So I think looking at how do we secure distributed systems? How do we secure microservice architectures or clusters that talk to other clusters, multiple clusters? We have a lot of customers that do that, right? They're talking across accounts, across clusters. I don't think that thinking is brand new. I think we can leverage a lot of that existing learning that teams already have and how to secure those systems, how to make sure that they're redundant, that they can take failure well, those type of things. The other thing, and I think you and I talked about this ahead of time, I don't want to make this all about AWS, and there, I'm sure there's competitors out there, and there's other products that are evolving. I think we recently released Agent Core, and I think what's really unique about that is that it's looking beyond just AI, generative AI, and the agents, but how do I deploy those and manage those at scale? And I think that's obviously an area of interest for a lot of vendors, is moving beyond just having an agentic framework, but to your point, how do I deploy that? How do I scale that? How do I think of things like memory, authentication and authorization that you mentioned, securing, how do I ensure that if I'm going to reach out to a third party that I do that securely and use standard authentication and authorization methods. So I think Agent Core, and again, I'm sure there's similar products that are coming out. They seem to be, fairly first to market with that. I think that's a really interesting area, right? So frameworks that allow you to productionalize agents and agentic systems I think it will be a growing area.
Yeah, I think that's really smart because to your point, there is a common infrastructure to agents that we don't see for other types of software. Like you said, real-time memory is really, really important. How do we sort of spin that up and make it work well? Similarly, how do we think about GPU support? I don't normally use GPUs when it comes to writing software, right? So even spinning up
Right.
a new cluster or load balancing has multiple dimensions now. It's not just sort of how quickly can I spin up another EC2 instance, for example.
Sure.
And so I'm totally with you. Having some of those tools that allow us to productionalize the software itself is really important.
And I think that's
So,
a natural evolution, right? As agents have come into being and are evolving very quickly. I think
mm,
you've seen this in other technologies, and I think it'll follow that same path to be able to productionalize these easier.
yeah, I think that's really smart. So here's where I'm processing what you're saying, and it makes me start thinking about this tension or dichotomy that I hear, which is to your point, agents have a bit of a superhero cape these days. And we say anyone can build agents, right? Hey, you're the HR person. You should build the agent, not an engineer. Like, the business process. And we've kind of seen this rinse and repeated with tools that, I won't name specific companies, but folks that say, hey, you could build no code B2B software, or you could build no code integrations and things like this, and try to like move that technology and abstract it so that
Sure.
the business logic can sort of take center stage. I'm starting to see this pattern with agents too. Yet there's a tension that's created because of what you just shared. They're very much computer science, like software engineering techniques in order to make great agents. So how do you sort of address that tension as you're working with some of these great organizations and they're trying to get this stuff out to the enterprise? They want non-technical users to define the agents, but you
Yeah.
need this sort of software skill in order to build ones that will serve the enterprise well, right? So how do you address that for them?
Yeah, maybe comment first. I think we're all guilty of that, right? AI,
Yeah.
machine learning, even data analytics, it's a very complex subject. And I think you don't want to overcomplicate it if it's not necessary to solve a problem. But I think we're also all guilty of undersimplifying it, right? To your point, we simplify to a point where we hide the complexity, and then the complexity becomes apparent later. And that's what
Mhm.
slows down POCs moving into production often, right? The customer didn't realize the POC was easy, right? To your
Mhm.
point, they clicked a few buttons, they're able to launch something and test it, but now they actually want to scale it up. Now you need to understand a little bit more about the underlying technology. So I think we're all guilty of that. I think the entire industry needs to kind of to have a better balance of explaining complexity and not under explaining it
That's right.
to a point.
I think it connects to your earlier point, which is, agents and Gen AI are an incredible capability. They're a
Mhm.
new thing that we've never seen before, and it's transforming the way software is built. But it doesn't mean that it replaces the whole process.
No.
Building great solutions still involve everything we've known before. This is additive rather than, strictly a rip and replace,
Right.
at least as it is today. So you really got to use both pieces together in order to build something awesome. So
Just to go
yeah,
back,
go
because
ahead,
I don't
please.
think I fully answered your question though, like in terms of the low code, no code or getting people
Yeah.
involved. I think we're those people, and those people are probably more critical than folks like myself or you that are technical in nature, is they're the specialists, right? We're trying to represent, not replace them. I mean, maybe replace them, but not necessarily replace them, but augmenting them. In order to do that, it's more important to understand what their specialized knowledge is, right? And that may or may not be technical. They understand the company, they understand the products, they understand how they would solve the problem, and we want to imbue the agentic system with that knowledge. So I think they're critical to the process. It doesn't matter how many technical people you have if you don't have the domain expertise, the specialized expertise, you can't build that system and replicate that domain knowledge within the system.
Yeah, I strongly agree. That was the point you made earlier around that's the point of all this, right?
Right.
Is to transfer a lot of that special sauce to the agent and also to keep the agent accountable and honest. We're still going to need that human in the loop that allows us to sort of make sure that that works well. So I totally agree with you. It's a holistic thing rather than saying either technology can replace the people or people could just go make it and technology is just agnostic and we don't care. this sort of coming together is really critical. And I would really agree with that. So if we zoom out a little bit, so far our conversation has been about how do we identify problems that agents can help with? What are the capabilities themselves when we talk about agents? What can they do that previous kinds of software tools couldn't do? And now we've talked about the idea of now that we've built a solution, trying to get it out there and getting it to scale. So let's imagine, we're all through these three pieces. Now, sort of the final part of our conversation is about now that we're at scale, we've done the right things. We've scaled well. We have the right permissions in place, all that kind of thing. And great. Now we have thousands or even millions of users coming to our customer service solutions or to our marketing solutions or whatever it is. How do you protect your tools as they go forward? One thing that we saw from the poll from our participants here is that, safety, compliance, risk, this is a big part of their story. So how do you think about making sure these systems are safe, especially because they have that degree of non-determinism? We don't always quite know what they're doing. So
Sure.
how have you advised different teams or companies in this regard?
Yeah. So I think two parts to that answer. The first part is not a cop-out, but I think, again, to some degree, a lot of what you're building is traditional software. And I say that to the point of we have systems in place, right? Mature development organizations have mature practices in place, DevOps practices, deployment practices, SDLC processes. We're able to efficiently, effectively test these things. I think to your point, the non-deterministic part of this is relatively new to a lot of us, but I think it also follows those same practices, having pipelines, being able. A good example that comes up, and we see it a lot, is I don't say customers. I feel like I'm saying negative. We all tend to want to use the latest model, right? But if I change models, even if it's a minor version, my responses can be very different, right? The end result from the model, which is underlying, if it's a reasoning model, which is underlying the agent, the behavior can be very different and totally change my system and in some ways break the system. So I think being careful about testing and also testing in advance, right? What's the next model we might want to evolve to, and testing that in advance and already building out those prompts, and then having a way to not only replace the model, but you may have to replace maybe those system prompts, which then speaks to maybe having better configuration management. Think of those prompts as configuration. Think of the model configuration and how easily those things can be compartmentalized and modularized and replaced in a system as you roll that out to production. So I think just thinking through that, I think that's something we don't think about. I hear that complaint, like we switch models and this stopped working, right? But to some degree, you wouldn't do that with traditional software. You wouldn't change out a database engine, or maybe more specifically, like a package version of a particular framework you're using without thorough testing. But oftentimes I think with AI, with the enthusiasm around it, maybe we're jumping models to the latest model a little too quickly without thoroughly testing it.
It's a great point, because there's different levels that you talked about. You mentioned packages, and I think, the developers on the call will understand this. You're using some OSS package. You don't just go to the 3.0 release. You probably build a new build with that thing, try to go test it, maybe put it behind a flag, try it out, make sure it's good before you go live. But to your point, we're a little bit quick to just switch over our value, when we build agents and kind of go. So one thing I'm hearing about with this kind of configuration piece, it's true for apps, when we think about overall commits or overall versions, but we also have to think about that infrastructurally too, because these are some underlying components, right? Kind of sits in the middle. So when we think about infrastructure as code, maybe that's one thing that we need to think about, which is what framework are we using? Was there a new version of that? Is that something that we have to sort of safeguard? So to your point, even though the processes are familiar to us that build software, the way we go about them or adapt them to the agentic world can be different. So you need new tools to be able to bring that to bear.
Yeah. And if I could, I think especially with agents, I know just in doing a talk last week, I think in the 3 weeks that led up to doing the talk and doing the deck, I bet the three frameworks that we referenced changed at least 3 to 4 times, which is abnormal, but not for this quickly evolving technologies, right? None of the frameworks are 1.0. They're evolving quickly. They're adding features. Oftentimes those are breaking changes. So I think more so whether it's as simple as a framework or something as major as changing a model or a family of models, is using the same testing rigor. I think that was my first point, that you would apply to any other software product you were building.
Do you have any advice or best practices for how to rethink those processes in an agentic first world? Is there anything that needs to change or evolve as a result of how the software works?
Maybe it goes back to the point about oversimplifying a complex process,
Mhm.
understanding the implications of changing a model. A great example is, hey, I have this prompt. I tested 5 models. This one worked best. But the reality is, for each one of those 5 models, that prompt should have been slightly different and optimized for that particular
Mm,
model provider or that family of models. So I think sometimes there's maybe a little bit of naivety around just what can change, right? I have a system prompt that works great. I'm not going to change it. Well, the answer is that that prompt needs to continue to evolve as the system evolves, as you add more tools, as the framework evolves, as the model changes. That those things are not static, right? There's just as dynamic as other parts of this agentic system. I don't know if that answered your question, but
I think it does. I think if I was to reflect it back to you, what I'm hearing is, the process for rapid iteration. We've learned a lot about how to rapidly iterate software and do it in a good way.
sure.
Adding these additional tools that can measure non-deterministic systems and feed that into the process of regression testing or testing CI/CD, different builds like that. That's how we have to think about it. Let's give us new signals into existing process so we can continue building good software. And
And
I
I don't know if all
truly
those
agree
tools
with
are
you.
there yet. I think those tools are still evolving, right? That natural arc as agents come into being, POCs, MVPs into production. I mean, there are some out there. There's some companies doing some great things, but to your point, non-deterministic testing, I think, is still a growing area of research and development for companies to develop those tools. Just like you saw it with generative AI and around testing models and evaluating models versus
Yeah,
traditional machine learning models. Testing and evaluating generative AI models is very different to some degree.
yeah, I'll echo you earlier. I'm not about to make this an infomercial for my company either, but for anyone who knows what Fiddler AI is, we deeply believe in what you're talking about. Both that it's early in terms of building the tools that will help people build great agentic software, but also that this is a core need that people need to happen. And to that point, I think the other trend that I would say, and maybe pick your brain on a little bit, is the idea of preventative medicine. Because these tools and systems are non-deterministic, on any given output, we don't quite know what it'll be. So it's very good to be able to observe and rapidly iterate, but that's usually downstream from the actual action that's happened, right? So how do you actually stop the sort of, bad outcome from happening in the first place? For example, getting prompt injection or jailbreaks, or on our side, making sure that your agent doesn't leak PII or something like that.
Right.
Um, are there any sort of considerations that you've thought of there, or any suggestions you would have for the audience when it comes to sort of protecting them against those outcomes in real time?
Yeah, I would maybe, and I see Karen's hitting us up for questions here. I would
Yeah.
say the great starting point in existing, and they've been around, but certainly not just specific to AWS, is guardrails. And most of the popular frameworks have access to guardrails. There's some great third-party guardrails, and obviously more mature products out there from cloud vendors and other vendors. But using guardrails effectively, I think, is a great first step. I see a lot of customers that's kind of an afterthought, but I think building that in right from the start, even if they're just for toxicity, maybe the
Mhm.
PII, and then build those guardrails up as you need them, is a good starting point.
In other words, testing, super important as part of the flow of how we build software,
Yep.
but also having some kind of runtime protection
Yep.
is equally important. You kind of have to balance those two. Totally agree. All right. Well, with a couple minutes left here, Gary, let's see if we can answer a question or two for the attendees that are here. I think there's been a lot of good stuff that's come through. So why don't we start from the top here? How do you decide when it makes sense to add an orchestrator instead of just extending a single agent?
I'll tell you how I start. I tend to always start with a single agent, unless it's very clear. I have two very distinct, there's a clear separation of concern. I tend to start, and this is probably how we tend to develop software too, with a single agent and adding tools to a point, and then I might go back and refactor and say, you know what, it makes more sense to split these tools off. This really should be a separate agent. There's a clear separation of concerns here. Like there should be a hyperplane here. Let's separate these tools and move those into another agent. But I think I tend to develop right. I just start writing code, and then at some point I split those into classes or modules. I do the same with agents. I don't know if that's the best approach. That's just personal kind of pattern that I follow. With customers, I think we're more organized, right? We try to understand, again, who are the humans in the loop? Are they specialized tasks? And if they are, we tend to start there with developing probably multiple agents or some type of multi-agent architecture, depending on how they're used to operating.
Yeah, that flows perfectly in the next couple set of questions, because I think people are really wondering about this multi-agent kind of approach, you know? So the next question I've got here is, when you've tried connecting multiple agents together, what has been the hardest part technically? Is it coordination, latency, or something else?
I think it's coordination. So what worked well, I had a single agent with probably too many tools, and logically I should have separated. It was working. And now I've separated that, and now I'm having trouble the orchestration between the two specialized agents, or the orchestrator agent and the two specialized ones. I tried Swarm. And I know that there's a couple frameworks that have that concept of no overall orchestrator, that the agents are kind of self-organizing. I've tried to implement that sometimes, and it's probably not the best use case. So still trying to understand maybe where a Swarm architecture makes sense over a more hierarchical orchestrator, specialized agent architecture.
Yeah, there's a trade-off there, right?
Yeah.
For every benefit, let's say in answer fidelity or speed or expertise you get from a multi-agent framework, you now have introduced new edges to your graph, right? Now you have to worry about every handoff. Was the handoff correct? And now you're testing those connections as well as the agentic behavior itself. So definitely a consideration of saying, do I need that separation of concerns, to your point? I think that's the single most important thing, is to nail the strategy. And then the technology of connecting them is fairly straightforward.
Maybe I'll just add, without going into too much depth, because it's probably a longer conversation. Also, maybe a different model would make better sense for this task versus that task. So maybe a more specialized model that can address this particular task. That's maybe not the best reason to have two agents, but if I can split those functions off to a separate agent, and the underlying model under that agent is something different that has a very specific performance characteristics that can solve that problem, or it's cheaper or faster, or that part isn't as complex as other parts, maybe I can get away with using a smaller agent or a faster agent. So thinking about, a model, thinking about the underlying models, and maybe using multiple models and using the agent as a point of separation between them.
I think that's great advice. Semantically, a lot of folks I talk to, I like to say ChatGPT is an English major, Claude is a STEM major. Think about it that way. That's important. And then also, do you really need Claude's PhD, or do you need a really smart bachelor's to be able to solve this problem?
A very small reasoning model or two models sometimes.
Exactly. Are we doing 4.0 nano versus, the full fat O1? That's what's critical. Yeah. So listen, Gary, it's been a pleasure getting to know you and talk to you about this, front line of agents here. It's been so exciting to be able to discuss the front lines. And, we're going to share this webinar very shortly with the attendees that are here. But again, we just want to thank you for your participation, and we'll be in touch really soon.
Yeah, Will, thank you. Karen, thank you. I appreciate the time today.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you.